It's time for the last seasonal before the World Championship, the Rise of the Underworlds seasonal. My name is Boulevard, and I'm going to be going over everything. And in order to go over everything, you know, I see a lot of people like asking for advice during the seasonal, people giving out unsolicited advice during the seasonal, and one of the ones that always strikes me as funny is people telling you like what to eat or when to eat or how to eat during the seasonal. And you'll see people that are like, oh yeah, like don't eat too big a meal, like make sure you eat a good healthy breakfast, you know, like eat a banana. Look, bitches will sleep for 2 hours, wake up, chug a monster, and go win a tournament. It's me, I'm bitches. But I'm not going to recommend that anybody do that, and I'm actually really hard-pressed to imagine a timeline where you from a parallel universe stops by and says, hey, you were gonna top the seasonal, but then you ate a turkey dinner for lunch, and instead you went 5-4. Like, it doesn't sound like a real thing. So, at this point, a lot of you have probably played in enough tournaments that you know what works for you. You can tell if you're performing well or you're not. So, do what works for you, and don't eat a banana for the first time in your life just because someone told you that it's the fruit that gives you the most good thinking brain cells. So, let's get into the tier list and stuff. Much like your breakfast option, Comfort is king for your seasonal lineup as well. Now, Player and Terra tweeted out this graphic just a couple of days ago. Now, this is the most played ranked decks in the Master rank for the last 7 days. I don't know if this is the America shard or if they combined all the shards. I don't think it really matters. But if we do just go off of the 3 most popular decks there, we have Nab, the Sivir Pile, or a Zero Aurelia, and Rally Elusives, and then, you know, pick where your Zed's going, pick which pink and yellow deck you're playing. You get the point here. And then, like, Lurkers is number 4. And for the Guardians of the Ancient season, I do think, if I'm recalling correctly, the 3 most popular decks, Nasus, Draven, Ezreal, and Dragons, were, like, just a straight rip off of the 3 most popular decks on ladder. You know, maybe a Zero Aurelia was a little bit more popular, kind of hard to remember, honestly, it was so long ago, but that was kind of what we expected to be the standard lineup, right? And this time around, it seems really difficult to actually predict what the standard lineup is going to be, and if you're just saying, hey, I think it's going to be the 3 most popular decks off of ladder, that's not a great indicator either, because I don't think Rally Elusive is going to be very popular, and even if you move down the chain, I don't think Lurker is going to be very popular anyway. What everybody is pretty sure of, what all of the analysts are pretty sure of, is that Nab and the Sivir Pile are going to be 2 extremely popular decks. Now, I went back and looked at the last 2 weeks or so of tournaments, maybe even a little bit further back, and there was actually no overlap on a specific lineup across any of the top cuts that I could find. There was a lot of 2-deck overlap, but nobody actually brought the same 3-deck lineup, unless we're counting the same players between Lorga Swiss and Lorga Top Cut because they got to change their lineups, but I don't count that because it's the same person that just didn't change their lineup. It doesn't really indicate anything. So there's a lot of options that players are going to have for this 3rd deck. I think Draven Ezreal is going to be the most likely. A Gigas had said that he thought that Twisted Fate Swain was going to be the most popular. I think that's another good call out. But essentially what you're looking at is Plunder, pink and yellow, 3rd deck. And the 3rd deck a little bit earlier on was Shen J4. Now, a couple of those players are even adding Fiora in to try and deal with the pink and yellow decks a little bit better. I'm a big fan of the 3-2-1 split on Shen, Fiora, Jarvan, 3-2-1. So, yeah, if you're wondering what the most popular lineup's going to look like, this is kind of the best that we can do with the information available. In a perfect world, I'd be able to tell you, like I have for the other seasonals, what I'm expecting, but realistically, there's just not enough information out there from the tournaments and what people have been playing already. So you kind of got what you got, and as always, Comfort is king, but it's nice to know what other people are going to be bringing, because if your Comfort lineup loses to it, then you probably should have been comfortable on something else. But I digress. So let's talk about the decks. Nab. Everybody knows what Nab looks like. It is the Sejuani deck of the format. A lot of matchups you can go in by leaning on the Sejuani. Other matchups you play aggressively with the Gangplank. It's a very solid tier 1 deck. Currently the #1 deck on ladder right now. So if you've been testing at all, you have a feeling of how you want to handle Plunder. Now, I really haven't seen anybody go through the consideration of, like, Plunder, Nab, whatever you want to call it, is the deck that I'm going to ban. I don't think anybody's going for that strategy. So this is probably something you need to be familiar with playing against with your lineup, because there's a lot of unknown factors that you can run into in trying to ban other things out, or trying to ban this rather than play against whatever they have open, because I would imagine that Nab is going to go into a lot of different lineups. That's kind of is what it is. Lee Sin is, honestly, Lee Sin might be one of the best positions it's ever been in. I think Lee Sin's incredible right now. As long as you're on the ban pink and yellow strategy, then I think that Lee Sin does really well against a lot of the other meta decks. Yes, it can struggle with Sejuani, but you either throw in a couple Will of Ionias or you open up your, your OTK turn with a Hush onto the Sejuani and you're looking really good. I think that Lee Sin is, like, really going to show up in Top Cut this weekend. I would put Lee Sin in top 3. I think Lee Sin might actually snag a top 3 spot. Definitely top 5. Sivir Ionia and a Zero Aurelia. It's really just kind of like what matchup charts are you looking for. Both of them kind of get out aggroed by every other triple aggro lineup, so it's not like you can really try and avoid that or hedge your bets against triple aggro by picking one of these decks instead. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of the Azir Aurelia right now, and something that I did want to mention about Sivir Ionia, because I think this is really important, is when Nab and Shen J4 really popped up alongside the Sivir piles as, hey, this is the counter lineup for the Sivir piles, like you leave open the Sivir and you just, you know, probably ban the Nab because I guess it has the better matchup against the remaining deck, and you just kind of play from there. I think on ladder, Nab has an advantageous Sivir Ionia matchup. Like, that's where the percentages fall. But from every high-level player that I've talked to, they individually have a positive win rate against Nab with Sivir piles, and that's even against other top-level players. So it's possible that it's one of those matchups that is just being played wrong, and if you go into this trying to, like, play a Nab lineup and leave open the pink and yellow, there is a chance that you are just going to lose to somebody better than you on Sivir Ionia. So that is like a stat that I wanted to call out, just so people are aware of that. You know, maybe jam that lineup a few more times against your friends tonight and see where it takes you. Shen Demacia, you'll notice I have a lot of decks in Tier 1, and I think that in a meta where there is no solved lineup, where across 2 weeks of tournaments nobody has topped with the same lineup twice, it's kind of expected to have a lot of Tier 1 decks, and every time I said, oh, I should move one of these out, it just didn't feel right. So Shen Demacia, probably the weakest deck in Tier 1, but it's just so safe. It's so solid, especially now with the Fiora adaptation coming out, really helping you against the pink and yellow deck. So, like, if your lineup is Nab, Sivir Ionia, and Shen Demacia, yeah, maybe you don't ban the pink and yellow because you're hoping for your Fioras to get in there and either do work on the blade dances or just barrier up and kill a Sivir, all that kind of stuff. And maybe, you know, you can take the Nab matchup into it anyway. Maybe your opponent bans the Nab because they're afraid of it. It's kind of hard to say, but I think that, like, if you are on Nab, Sivir Ionia, and Shen Demacia, yeah, it's a little bit more reasonable to leave open the Sivir Ionia than if you're on a given random pile with Nab, or a random lineup with Nab in it, rather. So Shen Demacia is super solid. Probably a top 5 deck. I don't know that it deserves to be, but it's probably a top 5 deck. I think Pod did a lot for this. Discard aggro, super well positioned aggro deck. I think that you'll see this in a lot of non-aggro lineups. It just does super well against Nab. It does really well against the pink and yellow decks, and that's really all you can ask for out of an aggro deck. This is definitely something that I think you're going to need to, like, players are going to use this to throw off your ban strategy, right? Where you're going to run into, like, Nab, Sivir Ionia, discard, and it's like, ah, crap. You know, I was planning on banning the Sivir Ionia, but now there's this discard deck that also beats all of my decks. And if you really want to try to win the game in the ban phase, I think that discard is something that you can utilize to your advantage in your lineup. You will have to know how to play it, and it's not the easiest deck in the game, but I'm sure everybody's played this deck at least once, right? It's what I used to climb to Masters this season. You can get a little bit creative with, you know, beating out other decks and things like that. Maybe you want to throw a little bit more burn into it, because I do think that Draven Ezreal is going to be a pretty popular deck, and I remember Mo, Mr. Emotional, last season had said that he had put Noxian Fervors in his discard aggro specifically for the Draven Ezreal matchup, and I do think, as I had mentioned earlier, that Nab, Sivir Ionia, and Draven Ezreal is going to be the most popular lineup, so it's something to keep in mind for sure. Now, I don't have those in this sample pile, but I'm sure you can figure out what to take in or out. You can go ask Mo for his deck list. Mo's current discard list actually looks wildly different than mine, but that is what it is sometimes. He's the expert, not me. I just hit Masters with it. What do I know? That sounded sarcastic, but it wasn't. Also, similarly, my Shen Jarvan list does not have Fiora in it, just because I think it's a little bit more standard that you're going to see Shen Jarvan. I don't know how much everybody's on the Fiora. Apparently, they were on it enough to make it into the graphic for the Player Terra screenshot, so kind of see how that goes. Anivia really fell off, but I think it's still fine, right? Like, if you are going into Nab, Sivir Ionia, and Shen Jarvan, then I think Anivia is really good. It also does pretty well into Draven Ezreal, so I think that Anivia is a little bit sleeper right now. It doesn't... Okay, here's where I get lost on this, because I think I had mentioned last week, I was told, people told me with confidence, that Anivia beats Azir Aurelia. And I don't know how they do it, man. I tried that matchup so many times. Like, my Anivia would get Defiant Dance, and I'd felt like I lose. Like, does your opponent just not draw Emperor's Dais? It's so difficult to deal with. My Avalanches do nothing. My Blighted Ravines are good, but they're slow, and they come down on turn 4, and that's not when I need to clear the board, because I'm getting my ass kicked by a sparring student that I can't kill through a stupid Shaped Stone. It's tough out here. But I do think that Anivia is really nice, and I actually think that, like, something along the lines of a triple control lineup with Anivia and a Viego deck, and maybe even Spooky Karma if you're on stream of Viego instead of Viego Ionia. But I do think that there's, like, a triple control lineup out there. It might even just be, like, Anivia, Draven Ezreal, and Spooky Viego. Like, I think that's actually, like, a pretty solid lineup. Will you run into timer issues? Not if you play fast. Just smash the pass button. Baby, you're playing control. What do you need to do things for? But I think that like Anivia, Draven Ezreal, and Spooky Viego might actually be like one of my dark horse sort of lineups. Maybe throw a Tom Rock in there somehow. We'll get into that a little bit later. Draven Ezreal. So Draven Ezreal's kind of fallen off over the last couple of weeks in like tournaments and ladder and things like that. You know, like barely squeaks into the top 10 decks played on ladder right now. But then I went and I looked at the matchup chart, and in case you can't tell exactly what you're looking at here, it does good into everything is essentially what it breaks down to. It doesn't beat Akshan Lee Sin, which is a deck that just like doesn't exist anymore. You know, this isn't like the biggest sample size. It doesn't do very well against like Viego and Anivia and other hard control decks. Yeah, I like Draven Ezreal just kind of like beats everything that you want to beat right now, and that's why I think it's going to be one of the most popular decks. Not only that, but like given the seasonal record of Draven Ezreal, for those of you that remember, I tweeted out last season when I was like, hey, these are 4 decks. These are the only decks that have put people into a top cut in all 4 seasonals. Draven Ezreal was highly number 1, putting 30 players into top 32 over the course of the 4 events, which is a lot. So I think Draven Ezreal is going to come out in spades. Might be number 2, number 3 deck. Probably number 3. So that's why Draven Ezreal is tier 1. I think this is like an auto-include in most lineups. The one thing you do have to worry about is those control players, and like control might actually be the way. Like if I had to pick, like if I was playing this weekend, I would probably be playing triple control. It would definitely be Anivia, it would definitely be Spooky Viego, and I'm a little torn on what that last deck would be. Maybe I would just run in Draven Ezreal myself. Maybe I would play Karma Ezreal. I don't really know. I didn't test. I'm not playing, so we'll see. But that's kind of my analysis for Draven Ezreal. You should play it is kind of the gist of it. Then we get into like stuff like Lurk, man. Tier 2, Lurk. I think that Lurk is a little bit too weak into the things that you can expect to see across a 3-deck meta. Like, things like Draven Ezreal, again, not super popular on ladder, but I think they do phenomenally into Lurk. You have a lot of weak units, followed by the fact that, like, you have so many, you know, good stuns and follow-up on the big units, thermo beams and tri-beams and things like that. I just don't see Lurk as a deck that you could play, but at the same time, someone's going to come through and prove me wrong. Lurk should actually probably be tier 3, but I already started shooting the video, so Lurk's in tier 2. Also, like, I do think that it is one of the better decks when it does perform averagely. You know, even if you don't find, like, an insane amount of Lurks, one Pike can really be all that it takes to swing a matchup, or, you know, you're down and out, but you get one good hit off with a Rek'Sai, and suddenly you've got a Jawfish in your hand, and you just clear their board. I think that Lurk gets a little bit more guff than it necessarily deserves, but I don't think it's going to be popular. I wouldn't recommend running it, even in a triple aggro lineup, but I'll get into what I would recommend out of lineups at the end of the video. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Viego, kind of the star of the show lately. Been picking up a lot of play. Deck lists getting refined left and right. This is a list that I think I made. Probably looks a lot like someone else's list. Grandpa Roji recently topped the Mastering Runeterra event with this. He was playing Missed Calls and multiple syncopations and things like that. Thresh is something that the players have unanimously decided just kind of is the way to go. And I don't even know that that necessarily has to do with like, hey, I really want to pull out my Viego with a Thresh, as much as it does it's just like Thresh is a really good control card. If Entreat wasn't better, you would 100% see Thresh and Anivia just as like a solid board control tool. So try to remember that like this is not Viego Thresh, right? Or not Nasus Thresh, rather. You're like, Viego, as much as he is your win condition, you don't need to get him out on board as soon as possible, and it can be a little bit dangerous to, like, send him into combat, you know, get cleaned up by a Flock or a Scorched Earth, something along those lines. Scorched Earth at an all-time high, a lot of landmarks running around, but point is, keep in mind that, like, Thresh is your control tool, not your summon my champion out of my deck and try to kill you with atrocity. I really liked the Darkwater Scourge Deathmark. I think that there are a few decks in the format that don't handle it particularly well. It can actually be really hard for like even Plunder to deal with it. Yes, Monster Harpoon does deal 5 damage, but they have to get a Plunder proc off in order for that to work out most of the time. And like if you just play this into the Sejuani or into their Gangplank, you know, maybe you get a kill off onto a champion. But it's a little bit too inconsistent against aggro. Again, put Noxie and Fervor in your discard aggro if like you're worried about Draven or even Ezreal, things like that. And if that happens and then you play against Spooky Viego and they just like Fervor their whatever, can feel really bad. But the point is, I think this deck is a little bit underrated en masse. Like as you'll see, it's not like, as you saw, it's not anywhere on the ladder right now in terms of like top 10 decks played through Masters. TF Swain and Twisted Fate Gangplank. You might have remembered me earlier on in the set saying that like I was aware of the adaptation. I wasn't totally sure what the difference was, because really there's not a whole lot different between the individual lists rather than the Gangplank or the Twisted Fate. So I was kind of curious, you know, like what is the adaptation that's coming out that's making people pick one over the other? And something that I stumbled across recently is that while TF Swain has a 40% win rate against Draven Ezreal, Twisted Fate Gangplank is a lot closer to like 55. So it swings that matchup pretty heavily. Both of them actually do really well against Lulu Zed, I've come to find. I think it was a small sample size for sure, but TFGP was like 90% win rate against Lulu Zed. So like if you're coming off of ladder, if you're really afraid of the Lulu Zed boogeyman, I definitely think like this is a deck that you should be throwing in your lineup. You know, maybe that is where, I mean, hey, maybe you just go for like the triple, you know, maybe that is your triple control lineup, is like a TF Swain and a Draven Ezreal and then a Nivea, something like that. You know, that actually does sound like really good into both aggro and the other decks that we're seeing. So like, hey, maybe that's the lineup, right? But yeah, there's a couple differences in the matchup charts. I would imagine that anybody who is severely invested in Twisted Fate Swain has tried the Gangplank variant at some point. You don't do very well against control, which is kind of expected. There's not a lot of card draw. You don't have really a lot of heavy hitters, but you're able to outvalue a lot of the other decks in the format. You're pretty even into Sivir Ionia from the stats that I saw. I don't think either one is necessarily more impactful against like a Zero Aurelia either, but hey, you know, it is what it is. I would imagine the Swain version is also better against Nab because GP doesn't do as much, and it's a little bit scarier for them to nab a Dreadway away from you than it is for them to nab a Leviathan. But hey, TF Swain, I think it's a solid choice. Starspring. As always, there's going to be one Star Spring in Top Cut. There's always one Star Spring in Top Cut every single season. I think I said on the last tournament Tactician that it missed a seasonal. I went back and checked, and it didn't miss nothing. Star Spring don't miss, baby. So there's going to be one. It's super polarized. You got to be brave. If I was playing in the seasonal, I'd 100% bring Star Spring. Because for every seasonal I've played in, I have always said I have two lineups. The lineup I'm going to bring, and the lineup I would bring if I had the balls to bring Starspring. And I never had the balls to bring Starspring. And you shouldn't either. It's not... It's so risky. It's so risky. You do so well into Nab. You do so well into Lee Sin. You just don't do well enough into Sivir Piles, Zero Aurelia. Shen mid-range is even a little bit rough. Those Screeching Dragons can really get to you. Lurk. There's a lot of like random decks that you lose to, and because you are going into a 9-round open man tournament, Star Spring's like nobody's gonna recommend this. There is gonna be one person that tops with it, but I can't in good conscience recommend it. Deep is another deck that kind of like does really well against some of the more random things in the format. It, from what I've heard, it actually just destroys Lurk. It's like one of the best decks in the game against Lurk. It does very well into Draven Ezreal as well. Deep is definitely something that, like, if you're afraid of control, if you want to hedge your bets against control a little bit more, Deep is something that you kind of slot into your lineup. You can use it as a great counter pick for things like that, but mostly like Deep is coming in because you're a little bit, as I would probably be, respectful of the potential of just all these control decks coming through at you. Pirates, getting into the aggro portion of things, right? With Pirates and Lulu Elusives. I don't recommend triple aggro. I know last seasonal I really pushed the narrative of like, hey, look at how historically poor aggro has done in seasonals, and I got kind of clowned for that because I wasn't saying like, hey, it's bad for this seasonal. I was just saying like, historically, here's what we're looking at, and then it turned out to be really good for the Guardian as of the Ancient seasonal. I don't think it's good for this seasonal. I think that while it can do well against your sort of projected standard lineup, and that's hard to say, right, because it's not even the standard lineup. It is what I expect to be the standard lineup, and I could be off on that. I don't think it does well into the triple control that I think is going to be probably one of the more popular lineups. I would say like it's standard, and then people hedging in like one or two control decks, or even going for the triple control. Just these things that are safe. A lot of safe decks going to be played this weekend. And aggro tends not to do well into that, especially with the newer version of Pirate aggro, at least the one that Floppy Mudkip won the AM Fight Night Seasonal Smackdown with, was 15 one-drops rather than 12, so really up in the guns there. And I just don't see that working out in a Make It Rain heavy format, in a Control heavy format, in a Draven Ezreal format. You know, maybe that's the necessary part, right, is you play 15 one-drops because you need to get through all that face damage to get the burn to finish people off. There's not a lot of life gain in the format, I will give you that. Outside of, like, Anivia and Lee Sin, a lot of these decks have extremely stagnant life totals. Nab, not gaining any life. Sivir Ionia, Zero Aurelia. There's Spirit's Refuge in the Sivir Ionia lists, but of course that's avoidable with something like Noxian Fervor, which of course you are still playing in the Pirate aggro deck. Draven Ezreal, historically, not as good against burn as it is against aggro. The distinction there being aggro is unit-based, burn spell-based, so... or direct damage-based. Legion Saboteur kind of counts as burn. But, yeah, you know, maybe that's where triple aggro comes to shine, right? Is you don't necessarily play aggro decks like, not that it's an aggro deck, but I'm going to use Lurk as an example, just as like a deck that doesn't have any reach. you can't get over the top. If your opponent's at 1 life, you can't deal that 1 damage. But things like Pirates and Spiders and Nox Shurima that have that over the top damage, I would expect that to work out a lot better than someone that tries to run just straight up aggro. You know, discard even. Good over the top damage. But that's kind of my take on aggro for right now. Is that you should be running things that play Noxian Fervor and Decimates and things of that nature more so than just trying to jam units on the board and have that work out, because the meta is a little bit too mid-range for that. And then Lulu Elusives, it really took Ladder by storm. Definitely one of the more popular swim decks in recent memory. I haven't really struggled against it myself. It looks like a lot of the standard decks in the format are going to do okay against it, mostly like Draven Ezreal, TF Swain. The more control-y decks rather than the more mid-rangey ones, and I think that's what it's looking to do. But I think that right now a lot of people are teching against Elusives pretty heavily because they are aware of not only this, but the prominence of things like Greenglade Duo. You're going to see a lot of Shadow Assassin and a lot of Ionia decks. You're going to see a lot of... not that you really care about the Tasty Fae folks, but... I'm just not particularly big on this deck, and this is kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about aggro rather than burn, because like if your opponent's at 1, yeah, you really can't get to them. Maybe you can sneak through the elusive damage, it's like almost half burn, but I would say that like Lulu Elusives is like fine. You'll probably be able to do what most aggro decks cannot and get through that over-the-top damage, but it is a little bit risky to just have no burn available to you. Then we get into Tier 3, the things that I'm not super hopeful for. Number 1, we have eggs. The main problem with eggs is the timer. There's a bunch of nonsense going around with the timer that I don't want to get into because I don't want to encourage the behavior from either side, so I'm not going to tell you how it works. So we're just going to skip over eggs, actually. Know that I don't recommend it, is the gist of it. Viego Sacrifice, sort of that Viego Shurima. It's gotten a little bit of a facelift, playing a lot more combat tricks like Scrying Sands and Quicksand and things like that, but ultimately, never been the biggest fan of this list. I just think it's a little bit... not as like hard control-y as I want a Viego deck to be. You know, it's not functioning kind of like my spooky Viego is, and I'm just not really sure where you bring this deck in. Maybe I'm just ignorant to the archetype. That's totally possible, but I know that for the most part, a lot of the Viego refinement, at least in the America side of things, has been aimed at the Ionia version, and that is the version that I hard prefer. I don't think there's any reason that I would bring Viego Shurima instead of Viego Ionia unless I was really sold on Spooky Karma, and my recent combination was spoken for, and that's why I had to do this, but hey, it is what it is. If you want to bring this, you know why you want to bring this. You know, maybe this is your 3rd Merciless Hunter deck. Maybe you even turn it into your 3rd Ruin Runner deck. That's really all I've got. Karma is a little scary, a little spooky to bring, you know. Eye of the Dragon's not the most consistent, especially when you're not running Gifts from Beyond like you get to in Lee Sin. It's a very solid control deck, and it'll beat out all of the other control decks, and I think that's kind of where you want it in a lineup, is like... If you say, hey, you know, I really think that like 3 control decks or 3 pseudo control decks is like really the way to go, but I'm worried about the other pseudo control decks, you know, how do I win the mirror? Karma Ezreal. That's where that comes in. It does pretty well against aggro. The problem with this deck is mostly the consistency of it. Like if you can get down a Karma and then get off one of your big draw spells, you'll usually find your way back into a game, but it can be a little bit slow to start, especially if you don't find that Eye of the Dragon, and it can be a little bit weak to things like Pirates and Lulu Elusives. All that kind of stuff, ultimately. Not the biggest fan of the deck and where it's positioned right now, but I think it's like a totally fine choice. You still got to ban that pink and yellow, though. You probably do okay against Nab. They do have some sick Nab targets against you, but you can definitely get out mid-ranged, which has usually been the problem with this deck. You'll do kind of fine in the early, kind of fine in the late, but the mid-game is really where you struggle, and with such a mid-game focused meta right now, I think that Karma Ezreal is going to struggle a little bit more than you want it to for a tournament so long. Frostbite mid-range is... I feel like this deck's looking good, but it's just not. And I don't know if that's people not bringing it, people not experimenting with it. Maybe the lack of, like, a total lack of interaction on kegs is what is getting you. Maybe we need to put Elixir of Irons back in this deck. But with leveled Sejuani posing such a threat to decks, I kind of thought that, like, you know, Frostbite runs along a similar manner. Maybe this is where we get to do it. Of course, it has access to that really cool LeBlanc and Incisive Tactician loop. But, I don't know. Maybe Lee Sin's not popular enough. Maybe Nab does a little bit too much against you. You do have removal for the leveled Sejuani, but, like, it's a seasonal. Frostbite midrange is one of those decks that gets power spiked at a seasonal. You're going to see, like, 4 or 5 Frostbite midrange in the top 32. I don't really know what kind of lineups they're going to go alongside, And one of the problems, of course, is that like Draven Ezreal has come up big in the last couple of days, and that is something that you will need to ban out if you are going to run Frostbite midrange. But I could definitely see a couple of lineups that are looking to ban the Ezreal Draven rather than the pink and yellow. And I guess that's kind of where Frostbite's going to come up short, right? Is you don't do super well against pink and yellow, you don't do very well against Draven Ezreal, and you're kind of banking a little bit too much on beating out that third deck with the Frostbite specifically. So like you have to open with it, because if you beat the third deck with your other deck, you're not going to beat pink and yellow with Frostbite, probably. And that's kind of where I take issue with Frostbite, but I do think that it probably has lineups that it can fit in. Players are going to top with it, either because the ban strategy lines up and they do get on, or the pick order lines up and they do get onto that third deck with the Frostbite, or they just run into someone who's not running Draven Ezreal or not running pink and yellow. Because even though like pink and yellow is going to be the most popular deck of the tournament, it's probably only going to be in like 30-40% of people's lineups. Maybe not even that many. Probably not that many. With a tournament this big, it's kind of weird because the most popular thing is still probably only like 20-30% of the field. 200-300 people out of 1,000. But as you get into the later rounds, you're going to run into it. So if you're on a 7-2 record, if you were high enough on ladder to be 7-2, I think that Frostbite has a lot more viability than if you need to go 8-1. Noxus, Shurima Burn, and Spiders. Kind of just filling out that burn strategy. These are Noxian Fervor Decimate decks, and I like that. That's what I want to see out of aggro right now. But I still just don't think that aggro is super well positioned. I kind of went over this with Pirates, so I'm not going to go too deep into these two specific lists. But if you do see a triple aggro list like Spiders, Nox, Shurima, Pirates, discard 3 of those 4, pick them, wrap them up, sign, seal, delivered, coin flip your way to a top 32, baby. And then I added in a Dark Horse section. Just some decks that like are either I don't know how to evaluate or I think have a lot of potential to be really good, like Thralls. Thralls fell off. At one point, I think this was the best tournament deck in the format, and I think that was true of like earlier this format, and then it just kind of fell off. And one of the reasons, of course, being Sejuani. You don't have anything that really deals with the Sejuani permanently. You can like 3 Sisters into Frozen Tomb it, but for the most part, you're not really playing too well against it. You just kind of get beat up by Nab in the early game. You're definitely not doing super well against Sivir Ionia, and apparently against the odds, Thralls actually has a good Draven Ezreal matchup according to a lot of the matchup charts that I've looked at. Yes, they have Scorched Earth, but apparently that just doesn't matter because you can diversify the landmarks so often. And I think that Thralls is a deck that has been really tossed aside, unexperimented with. I think that the turn 5 blowout potential is really going to catch a lot of decks by surprise when they should be getting online. I wouldn't even be surprised if like the best Thralls hand beats the best like Sivir Ionia hand. I don't think it ever beats a Zero Aurelia. And maybe that's where Thralls gets into this cool kind of flexibility within your lineup, where rather than going on a ban pink-yellow strategy like you always ban the Azir Aurelia, and then if you do run into Sivir Ionia instead, you can actually leave that open. So I think it's kind of where Thralls fits into the meta. I'm a little interested to see how it performs this weekend. Demacia Sivir Akshan surprisingly has like a 60% win rate against Azir Aurelia and Sivir Ionia. And it still allows you to run a Zero Aurelia alongside a Sivir Akshan deck. And I think that's where you're going to be seeing this most of the time. And ultimately, I don't hate it. I think that it's a really interesting deck that I unfortunately never got to dig into too much. But this could be something that catches a lot of people by surprise and throws off their ban strategy when they see effectively 2 pink and yellow decks. Yes, you don't have the combo potential and the lethal potential of like, oh yeah, let me ghost and flurry of the fist and things like that. But you play the mid game a little bit differently, I will say. Like you've got more barriers, and barriers are good in the Sivir Akshan mirror, so that's kind of where this deck finds its footing. But ultimately, I think this one has a lot of potential to like upset some ban strategies, which I think might be one of the underestimated strengths of this tournament, is what can upset the ban strategy the most. Then we talk about Scouts. This is a deck that always gets power spiked at seasonals for whatever reason. It's been happening for a while. It's probably going to happen again. You're not necessarily on the Stony Suppressor version. Yes, a lot of these decks are like very combo focused and have a bunch of spells, but they can just like beat you down with a Sivir and a Ruin Runner and then build up enough mana to go for it. It's not like you have the interaction to stop them from just pumping 10 mana into a Ghost and a Flurry and a Shaped Stone and killing you. But Scouts is a deck that just kind of always gets its power spike later on in the meta, so I think that this one is viable. Not sure where to put it on the tier list or in a lineup, which is why I'm just kind of like calling it out. The Dark Horse decks are more call-outs than like things that I want to highlight. And then the Voltron, the Draven Riven. A ladder hero lineup, if someone just wanted to run like, hey, here are the decks that always beat me on ladder, it's probably like Voltron, Lulu Elusives, and Lurk. And that can be a really scary, super high rolly lineup. So I think that You know, somebody's going to bring that. Someone wants to just coin flip the seasonal and said, hey, baby, it's Lurk, it's Lulu Lucis, it's Voltron. So that's just kind of like something that you need to be aware of. Maybe, you know, if you're like torn on the fence of like, oh, yeah, you know, maybe I just want to like cut the hushes entirely from my deck, or you have... I don't know, some kind of like stun effect or something where you're like on the fence about it. You're like, oh, I'm not really sure like what matchups I want this for. Maybe I cut this or something else. This would be the reason to keep it in. Now, when it comes to lineups and ban strategy, it's a little bit all over the place. You really need to be flexible with your ban strategy. That's going to be one of the most important things going into the seasonal because... as I had mentioned, like, if there's no standard lineup, there's no standard ban strategy. You can't just be like, all right, yeah, let me close my eyes and ban Sivir Ionia every time. If there are going to be random decks thrown in alongside it, like Star Spring or a discard aggro that just, like, completely upset things. So you almost want to make, like, a tier list of, like, hey, this is the most important thing to ban, this is the second most important thing to ban, which I would recommend that you do anyway so that you have a good idea of, like, if you're like, okay, yeah, I just ban pink and yellow every time, and then you get into a matchup where your opponent doesn't have any pink and yellow, then you might sit there and, like, kind of flounder, like, oh, no, I wasn't prepared for any of this. So you really need to prepare for single decks rather than lineups in terms of, like, hey, here's my ban strategy, because you're going to see it fluctuate all the time. You might even see 3 decks that you thought would never go together get paired together and just get stuck in there. So as far as like what we're looking at with lineups that I expect to be popular, as I had mentioned earlier, I think Nab, Sivir, Pyle, and Draven Ezreal is going to be the most popular lineup for America. Maybe that Draven Ezreal gets swapped out with TF Swain, as Gigas had mentioned, but I think the Draven Ezreal is going to be just a smidge more popular, mostly based on ladder stats. As far as aggro, I think that Discard, Pirates, and Nox Shurima is the best aggro lineup, but take out one of those for Lulu Elusives probably. Maybe I am discrediting how effective elusives actually function as burn spells. That's totally possible. I'm not very well versed on these kinds of things. But I do think that you need to have a very burn-centric strategy in order to play aggro in this seasonal. I think that too many things are just too good against you throwing down a couple of units left and right. I think you do need to have a lot of over-the-top damage available to you in order to come out on top. And then, of course, for a more controlling lineup, something that's going to beat those aggro lineups, we've got like Viego, Anivia, Draven, Ezreal. As much as I'd like to throw Karma Ezreal in there, because it does... you know, sort of hedge out your control matchups, it doesn't do as well into aggro as some of the other decks that we have available to us, while still kind of calling it a quote-unquote control lineup like Draven Ezreal does. But I think that Viego and Anivia are things you should definitely not sleep on. But it's possible that players don't all in on that kind of control lineup, right? They might just splash one of them in, because once again, comfort is king. I would definitely implore you to just... think a lot more about your deck choices than your necessarily lineup choices. Like, I know I always say, like, comfort's king, just grab the 3 decks that are most comfortable to you, and you will see people top with random lineups like that. Like, oh, what's your lineup? Oh, yeah, it's Star Spring, Noxus Shurima Burn, and, you know, Lee Sin. That was my lineup. That's random, baby. But... that's kind of all the knowledge that I can implore on you. Unfortunately, this one wasn't like as analytical as it usually is. It's kind of hard when there are just so many decks. I mean, this is probably the most decks I've ever had in Tier 1, and that really is just indicative of the format that we're in. When you can't find a centralized lineup, it's because people are playing so many different decks, which means there are just more good decks. So hopefully I have done you some kind of service in aligning all of the stars for you, helping you figure out what decks you will see, will not see. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. You can follow me on Twitter at casterboulevard. I wanted to get this out earlier. I wanted this out to be in the middle of the week. I got caught up doing that Wild Rift article. If you guys saw it or not, I actually wrote an article about Wild Rift, so that was fun. It was fun. I'm glad I did it, but it did eat into my seasonal prep time. So... yeah, I hope that you guys found some kind of nugget of wisdom. Maybe you didn't find all 30 minutes useful. Maybe you only found 2 minutes useful, but hey, at least you found something useful, and I appreciate you watching through to the end. So, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching. If you're wondering when the Worlds qualification will be up, because as of last night, we did technically lock in like 25 people from each region for Worlds based on ladder placement. I don't think that implores Riot to get it out any faster, so we'll probably be waiting a couple of weeks before we have all of that signed, sealed, delivered, dotted the I's, crossed the T's, all that kind of stuff. But we should be getting out the World stuff pretty soon. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. Good luck in your seasonal. Good luck in Top Cut. Good luck in the World Championship. Good luck in whatever capacity you decide to play Legends of Runeterra.